As a crisis in capitalism, why is the coronavirus pandemic different from previous crises in the neoliberal era? Here to discuss that with me is Radhika Desai. I'm Lynn Fries, and this is Global Political Economy, or GPEnewsdocs. Radhika Desai joins me from Canada, where she's a professor of political studies at the University of Manitoba and director of the university's Geopolitical Economy Research Group. She's author of numerous titles, including Geopolitical Economy After US Hegemony, Globalization and Empire. We are talking about The Unexpected Reckoning, Coronavirus and Capitalism, an op-ed in which Professor Desai makes the case that with the onset of the coronavirus pandemic, Western society is now staring a long-term reckoning in the face. Long-term as it's been building up for decades, essentially since Western capitalism took the neoliberal road out of the 1970s crises. Professor Desai, welcome.
Thank you, Lynn.
Radhika, start by giving us some background on the neoliberal turn of the Western capitalist system.
Essentially, what happened is that capitalism seemed to have become unable to reconcile the competing demands, keep productivity rising, which would then allow the workers to gain higher wages, etc. So there was a crisis. As you will remember, there also emerged a new right personified in Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. And you will also remember that throughout the 1970s, there was also a lot of labor unrest. And if this were not enough, third world countries and producers of commodities, which were critical to the West, began demanding higher prices for their products. So amid all of this chaos and mayhem, there was a contest between left and right. And the right said we have to move in a different direction. There was too much regulation in the 50s and 60s in the so-called golden age. It has destroyed capitalism's mojo, and now we have to remove the dead hand of the state, and we have to allow capitalism to flourish in an unfettered fashion. The new right won the day. And what we have been seeing is the unfolding of the consequences of that major turn that was taken at the end of the 1970s. So essentially what we can see is that over the last 4 decades, we have had, in most of the world, really, not all, but in most of the world, we have had the application of neoliberal strategies, which essentially means that you increase the freedom of capital to do what it likes, and by contrast, you decrease the freedom of labor, reduce the demands of society in terms of labor or environmental or other regulations, and so on.
So that, in a nutshell, is what you mean when you talk about the neoliberal strategy to reinvigorate capitalism.
Invigorate capitalism and get its animal spirits up again, and then it was going to essentially start investing and so on. In reality, this did not happen.
Explain the reason for that.
Part of the reason why investment demand does not expand is because if you are a capitalist and you look around you, you look at the very sad demand conditions, consumption demand conditions, you say, well, now is not the time to invest. So this is one of the simplest and the most basic problems. And the reason for that is simply because neoliberalism has cut back state expenditure, which was often in most countries, it is the source of a fair degree of demand, both investment and consumption, because governments produce services, they invest in productive equipment, they invest in infrastructure, etc., etc. So all of this has tended to be reduced. And of course, consumers cannot increase their demand because workers, other small producers, including all the small producers in third world countries, and of course also small business people in first world countries, all of these people have been squeezed in one form or another by being offered low wages and low prices. Neoliberalism has essentially not permitted demand to expand.
So what was happening?
What was happening is that the profits that were being made, and of course with increasing freedom of capital, more profits were being made, and these profits were being diverted into what we may call financial investment. And the best way of understanding the difference between the two, because we confusingly use the same words to talk about investing in the stock market and to talk about investing in a mill or a factory, is this. Productive investment essentially is investment to produce new goods and services, which we always need. Whereas financial investment is simply an investment in assets or in paper representing assets that have already been produced. So that does not add to our productive capacity. So more and more investment went in the direction of financial investment. And this investment not only does not expand productive capacity, in many ways it strangles productive capacity, because by holding out the prospects of making even more money in financial investment, you actually lead to further declines in productive investment. Plus, it tends to exacerbate inequality, and neoliberalism generally exacerbates inequality. So as we know, for the last 40 odd years, in most first world countries, wages have either risen very slowly, real wages have either risen exceedingly slowly, or they have been stagnant, such as in the United States. Neoliberal policies, because they put money in the pockets of people who are less likely to spend it either in their personal consumption or in investment, in productive investment, this simply means that the demand has not expanded. The only thing that has expanded are financial bubbles, the chase for profits which can be made without producing anything.
So this is the situation we're in after decades of neoliberalism.
In the 1950s and 60s, businesses and financial corporations did not have the freedoms that they had in the neoliberal period. There was just was not that kind of financialization. So we didn't also have financial crises, but now we have frequent financial crises. The productive structure that is now under attack, that is now being threatened by the new pandemic, it has been weakened by 4 decades of neoliberalism. And one simple way of looking at it is that it has been weakened because, of course, credit is harder to come by and more difficult to obtain and often very fickle. These productive companies themselves have had to report higher degrees of profitability, so they have tended to invest abroad in search of the lowest possible wages. But this also means that there are all sorts of other threats. The longer and more complicated the supply chain, the more any stage of it can be disrupted. So it brings an extra degree of fragility to the productive structure. The other thing that has happened as a result of neoliberalism is that because the productive economy has not expanded, and because people must at the end of the day find some sort of work, what has expanded is services. And service expansion is not necessarily a bad thing, but over expansion can be, especially where this labor could be diverted to producing things that are needed. Anyway, we have an overextended service sector, and most service sector activities require face-to-face production. When these are affected, that means a very large part of the economy on which ordinary people depend has been disrupted.
That's an example that really clarifies what you mean in saying that this time around the real economy has been affected, and why that's bound to make this crisis different from previous crises in the neoliberal era.
Problem is arising from the fragility of our productive economy, and the shock of the pandemic has actually exposed that fragility. So that's the reason why monetary policy can no longer play a role, even after the announcement of the $2 trillion stimulus by the US Federal Reserve. Markets are not convinced that this is what we need. This is not going to be enough. There have been financial crises all along, and all along the message could have been read in these crises that, these crises are happening because what is happening is that the financial economy is expanding at the expense of the productive economy. But rather than understanding this, what has happened is that going back to the 1987 stock market crash, our governments and public authorities, including central bankers, have had a very different reaction. They have said, oh, there's nothing wrong with our productive economy. Everything is hunky-dory. All we have to do is ride out this financial crisis.
In your op-ed, you talk about this in terms of the crisis of crisis management.
The realization should have sunk in that this is no way to run an economy. We really need to put a stop to financialization. We really need to reorient our economies in a big way, but the message was not heard. People began, central banks and neoliberal Western governments continued their merry way down the neoliberal and financializing road. Inventive monetary policy fixes was mesmerizing the public and making them think that they are all these, masters of the universe were out to, they were straining every gray cell to try to solve the problem of our economy. But none of these were actually capable of solving the problem. In fact, if anything, they were making it worse because they were spurring on further financialization, which only spurs further inequality over the last decade since the 2008 financial crisis. Inequality in the Western world, which was already at legendary high levels, was further exacerbated. That's all it accomplished. But all this talk also accomplished something else, and that is it prevented us from talking about that part of government policy which could have achieved results and which we needed sorely to achieve results, and that's fiscal policy. Sounds like a fancy word, but all it means is that the government spends money. It can spend money either by taxing, and certainly there's a lot of room for taxing those with obscene amounts of wealth, which there are plenty of those people today, and it can also do so by borrowing, obviously within reason, but there is a fair degree of room to borrow at the present exceedingly low interest rates. So fiscal policy was the thing to do. Massive expansion of government's own demand, rectification of the inequality of incomes by a more progressive taxation policy. The neoliberal decades, for 40 years, our tax policy has moved in a regressive direction, asking poor people to pay more money than rich people do, proportionately. Let's look at it this way. Neoliberalism was supposed to restore the animal spirits of capitalism, restore the mojo of capitalism, and it has not done that. Well, what is the other agency that can invest, pay people, create employment, invest, expand demand on its own, etc.? It's the government. And if this government is democratically controlled, then we can all democratically control the direction in which government fiscal policy is directed. And that means that we should move from essentially having government spending go into the pockets of rich people to government spending go into the pockets of and serve the needs of the vast majority of ordinary people in every country. One of the things that this crisis has also made us realize is that there's something fundamentally wrong about the way we interact with nature. I mean, before the pandemic hit, already the issue of climate change had become very big. We have had the most unusual winters and summers and all of that in the last many years, and particularly over the last couple of years, this has been quite obvious to people. So add to that this pandemic, which also throws up another very problematic aspect of our relationship with nature, which is how we farm animals and the destructive character of our relationship with nature. I think that any progressive solution can also take care of that, because we would be in a position to determine for ourselves democratically how we want to organize our relationship with nature, instead of leaving it to capitalist companies who engage in large-scale factory farming and other forms of environmental destruction that have brought us to the point, because practically every measure of environmental destruction will show you that things have gotten considerably worse in the neoliberal period, that the destruction of the environment has actually accelerated during this neoliberal period. So that is another chance to take a deep breath, to take a pause and say, is this the direction in which we really want to go? And can we use the present crisis as an opportunity to reorient our societies and our economies?
Radhika Desai, thank you.
Thank you, Lynn.
And thank you for joining us. From Geneva, Switzerland, this has been news and analysis of the global political economy by GPEnewsdocs.